For me, when I started reading comics, I really resented the people who would call them funny books or shallow kind of, stories for kids, not real books. Like if you're really smart, you read real books. And if you're kind of dumb, you read comic books because it's dumbed down. And I always resented that because I would read kind of the New God stuff with Kirby. I would read, Burns' work on Fantastic Four and what Claremont had going on, and the Teen Titans and some of Perez, and just a bunch of indie comics. You're reading Badger and reading Grell, and just all these books you had to read and you had to remember things. I don't think it's true that it was for casual readers. It was, you had complex plots and character development. That always used to bug me. So maybe that's one of the reasons why today some of the modern writing style of comics bugs me, because it feels like they've dumbed it down finally to what everybody was accusing it of being many years ago. Hey everybody, this is Perch. This is one of those things where I think you'll either gravitate to what I'm saying or not. It's going to kind of be pretty binary one way or another. But if you read comics in the 70s and 80s, then you probably know that when you picked them up, they were filled with some reasonably complex things. They were still comics. I mean, you used to have people flying around and blasting energy things out of their hands and everything else. But if you read like The Crow, or you read, and like, I mean, there's so many indie books, there's so many comics of kind of all different levels of complexity. I think if you read Watchmen or you read anything by Alan Moore, for example, it's not like this is a casual read that any simpleton could kind of pick up and understand. There's a lot of depth in those stories, and I think even in the mainstream big two, you had complexity, whether it was what Green Arrow was up to, or Spider Man, or I mean, you'd hit storylines where like Captain America was turned into a werewolf, and in many cases, the '90s did have quite a few comics I would say are pretty shallow that didn't have a lot of complexity. Not all, of course, not even close to all of them, but there were probably more of them. But especially in the '70s and '80s, it's probably why that era I like the best, is because the comics were pretty deep, pretty complex. There was lots of elements, there were lots of spinning plates, and that it coincided with the big growth of comics. New readers were able to come into comics, and somehow, dumbass Americans that we are, we're able to grapple with these concepts. And even if you weren't familiar with comics, you're able to kind of get on board and figure it out. And then it felt like in the '90s or really the early 2000s and the late '90s, there was this kind of mantra of like, well, we've got to get new people in, so things like continuity and complexity and that's going to be too hard for people to figure out. And if you were collecting comics in the '80s and '90s, you might remember kind of the irritation you felt when other people outside of comics dumbed it down. I said about this in another video, but like people are writing a news article about comics and like, biff pow, comic books are on the scene, and you won't believe what superheroes are doing, even if they do wear their underwear outside their costume. Kablamo. And it's like, God, that GIF of Robert Downey Jr. kind of rolling his eyes that you see all the time pop up. That's always how I felt. Like, Jesus, I mean, what a sickening low bar way of talking about comics, particularly when there are so many good deep comics out there. And there still are, by the way, there still are plenty of deep comics. However, it strikes me that take X-Men for example. I was talking with a good friend about how the comics are actually, what's funny, I've had this same conversation with multiple people. I was just thinking about this, isn't just one person. I've had this conversation with 3 or 4 people, all of who I think are pretty smart, radically different personalities and comics they like, but all with the same perspective. Is why is it that what some writers spent years kind of building up these deep personality traits, like take Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler has a religious background. He was ordained a priest. He's questioned his faith because as a mutant, he's often been persecuted for being different, and often by members of the church. The God loves, man kills storyline, and kind of other aspects of people using religion as a way to attack him. and Nightcrawler is pretty deep as a character. But today, and really for the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years, it feels like the most we really get into that is this vague kind of Nightcrawler is religious. That's his personality. He's religious. What does that mean? Well, it means that every now and then he bounces around. He kind of gives generic dialogue, but they'll have a panel where he's like, fondly rubbing a cross that he's wearing across his neck, or he'll say things like, oh, I believe in God. Like these statements have no meaning, and it makes you. Do the writers even know what religion he belongs to? What the nuances are of that religion? Does it even matter anymore? I mean, are we writing him Jewish or Catholic or Baptist or snake handler? I mean, it like I don't think anybody's really thinking about that anymore. It's just he's religious. Kitty Pryde is Jewish, and for a while that was a pretty kind of key part of her story, and then it kind of got reduced to she wore the Star of David around, but that's about it. And then now she's like a crazy pirate. And as this guy pointed out, different person I'm talking to pointed out, they cremated her in Marauders, which is a pretty big no-no for that religion. But does anybody know that, or do they care, or is it a like? Do the writers remember this? Did anybody think to Google? And you got Nightcrawler there hanging out. Do you think Nightcrawler, who's supposed to be plugged into these kind of religious services, do you think he would be like, hey, this isn't what we should be doing? But he's like, nope, I'm just standing right here. Let's do this, and then we'll figure out a way to get her resurrected by the bubble guys, and all work out. Let's get gold balls on the case, and then we'll get a new Kitty Pryde out of here. Don't worry about it. I mean, and the same thing goes with all the X characters, but it's not just the X-Men; it's everywhere. I know that I think that you've got a variety of LGBTQ issues in comics and characters and storylines, but it feels like they're all kind of dumbed down way worse than they were 15, 20 years ago. Shade the Changing Man, Sandman, Doom Patrol. I mean, it's weird to think of Doom Patrol, whose contribution to kind of queer lifestyle included a sentient street named Danny the Street, which was, if you're not familiar with this, it was a street that was gay and or queer, and I mean, I don't even know how to describe it in a short sentence. You'd have to read the book, but it's weird that the handling of that in terms of LGBTQ kind of storylines back in, I think this was early 90s, was dramatically more complex and nuanced and better, honestly, than storylines we get today, where it's like, hey, check out Dakin. He hits on men and women. He's got a man bun, and he goes for everything. Representation, and it's like, what you've dumbed it down. You've dumbed down the comic. You've dumbed down the topics. And what's weird is simultaneously, while you've been dumbing it down, you've made a bigger deal about getting more representation in the creative teams and how it's important to you. You've issued these statements about diversity. We've got some. We're hiring this award winner who's going to represent LGBTQ issues in the comics really effectively, but we're going to do it in a way of like, Dakin goes for boys and girls. Duh. That's how it comes across. I mean, was this what anyone had in mind for kind of diversity? Is this diversity? Because this is lame diversity. How are you getting beat by a sentient queer street? Like yeah, you shouldn't. That shouldn't be a way better storyline and more realistic. How is that a more realistic representation of the community than this stuff? I mean, yikes, right? But you could go down the list of like these comic characters, and I'm picking on the X-Men here, which I know the X-Men fans will get pissy about, but you could do the same thing for Superman. You could do the same thing for the Justice League. You could do the same thing for almost many of the comics right now, in that they've been boiled down to just a couple shallow traits, one-dimensional traits. And when you push back on it, and this is kind of what triggered this. I apologize for sounding like a rant, but this kind of thought process is I'm watching some people argue, And the first card that gets pulled out is, well, you're just hateful. But that doesn't really wash when the person who's complaining is making the argument of, I wish these storylines were more complex and more detailed, and actually put these lifestyles and these other things in a better light. When you're arguing for that, you're arguing for more. It's hard for somebody to come in and say you're a hateful bigot, you don't want to see these storylines, because it's clearly not what you're saying. It doesn't mean people can't do it, but they you know, it just you sound ridiculous if you're making that argument. But then the follow up argument is the one that got me, which was, ah, this is just comics. It's just comics. What do you expect? It's comics. Like, what, why are we expecting art? Why are we expecting anything complex? This is like, you slow your roll here. 22 pages of funny books. Like, you expect deep political thought? You expect kind of character development? It's comic books. What do you think? This is a YA novel? Come on. And it's like, what? Why are some of the creators defending the comic books, defending shallowness like that? And again, we had this in comics. We had it. We had deep issues, and it's just like, why is Saga a book that is, features space aliens and kind of wacky situations? Why is Saga able to handle these kind of deep current year social issues way better than comics who are employing people who are theoretically experts at this stuff? I just, what? When you go to the X-Men, you shouldn't have it boiled down to, well, Cyclops is a serious one. He's always like blah 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 tactics. And Wolverine is the one who does some violence, but he doesn't really want to do violence, but he does a little bit of violence. And Daken is the horny bisexual one. And Storm is the serious one that will say goddess and smile at weather patterns. And Gambit is horny, but only for Rogue. And Rogue is serious and has a southern accent, but also a little horny. And Kitty Pryde is a pirate. And Nightcrawler is the religious one. And, Jean Grey is the one that just kind of shows up to solve some hard problems and sleeps around with Cyclops and Wolverine. And Magneto's old and has some powers. And, Professor X is bald. Is that, I mean, ugh, is that the best we can do? I fear that if I went into Marvel and they're like, they handed me, this doesn't even exist, but they handed me like a character style guide. Like, here you go, here's your primer for writing the X-Men. And I open it up, it would be kind of like what I just said. It would just be, Professor X is the bald one. He used to be in a wheelchair, he's not anymore. The end. Really? Is that as good? And two, these companies brag about doing all this planning. Like, oh, we do lots of meetings over and over to plan this stuff out. And we came up with Daken is the kind of gay one, but not completely gay, but a little gay. That's what we got. Ugh. I don't know. Again, as somebody who grew up reading comics and enjoyed the complexity, loved the stories, and always resented people who had trivialized comics as being kind of stupid. I that always drove me nuts, and so it's hard for me to look at comics now and go, hey, we finally become the stereotype that was untrue 30 years ago. Yay! Anyway, what do you think? Making too big a deal about it? Probably. Like, unlike, subscribe, comment, social media, email, all those things. Thanks for listening.